I've mentioned before that the class that I teach at Grand Canyon University begins with a discussion of a worldview, or what a worldview is. I think the idea is to help the students who are nurses have an understanding of their own way of perceiving the world in which they live. So that the lens, worldview is a lens through which you look at the world based upon, one, how you've been raised, your family, perhaps your gender, your sexual orientation. There's a lot that goes into making up one's worldview that includes such things as your belief in the divine or the supreme power, belief in the universe, what the meaning or what the purpose of the universe is, what human persons are, what constitutes, how you understand human nature of the person, how you understand knowledge, where does knowledge come from, or what knowledge constitutes, ethics, your ethics and ethical and moral choices and decisions, and ultimately what your purpose in life is based upon this whole worldview. Think of it this way. If you have a very negative view of the world, then all of those things that I just mentioned are going to turn out very negative. If you have a positive view of the world or yourself, then there's going to be a positive way of understanding the world. But in this worldview, I mentioned that it's about a lens through which you look. It also means, just look at how many people are in the room here. Each of us have our own worldview, so it becomes very complicated and very difficult at times to even try to have a conversation with some people, right? Because it's obvious just from maybe the first words that they say that their worldview is just not ever going to match with your worldview. And there's not going to really be much of an opportunity or chance or reason to have any kind of discussion or dialogue with them, because it's just a clash totally and completely. I share all of that because for those of us who know about the scripture, that really the writers of the scripture have a particular worldview. In other words, they're taking the resources that come to them. They are considering the world in which they live, whether that is in 2000 BC, before the Common Era, or in their contemporary time, let's say the first century of the Common Era. Then when we come to the text that has come to us filtered over the generations with various interpretations based upon various worldviews, that then we come to the text with our own worldview. I gave you an idea about the history of the Feast of Epiphany. Well, the same thing applies to those kinds of things, right? That traditions come out of a worldview. This is how we do it because that's how we view the world, how we really want to shape the world based upon our particular worldview. And so even in the traditions that our communities have, they're often the product of a worldview. I share that again because, well, let's consider this. If it's based upon an individual worldview or a community worldview or a particular religious worldview or political worldview or economic worldview, is that locked in stone? Is that the way it always is or always has to be? Well, let's consider this, not to take too long with this, but let's consider this. Back around, all the way back to the very beginning of the Greeks, there was a particular way of observing the universe. And the Greeks believed that obviously, if the point that you're standing on is stationary and everything seems to be moving around you, that you must be the center of reality. And hence, a Greek scholar, astronomer, says, obviously, and by the way, his name was Ptolemy, so if you ever get on Jeopardy, that's the answer to the question, that Ptolemy came up with an understanding of the universe that said that the earth was at the center of the universe and everything revolved around the earth. And that was the truth that everybody accepted, believed in, followed. They taught it in the schools, it was in the books, wherever it was. That's what you believe. And there was not to be any derivation or deviation from that at all. until some other wise astronomers come along in the 16th century, and they look out through their newly created telescopes and go, well, that ain't right. That's not how it works. That rather than the Earth being at the center, it seems that the sun is stationary and we're revolving around the sun. Oh, by the way, another question answer on Jeopardy is Copernicus. And Galileo, another famous name that appears on Jeopardy every once in a while. You must know I watch Jeopardy every night. Stephen and I have a contest to answer the questions on Jeopardy. Copernicus develops this theory and says, well, this is more than a theory because this is fact. This is how it is. Well, needless to say, at least Galileo gets thrown into prison by the church because the church had bought into the worldview of Ptolemy, and anybody who came up with another idea must not be speaking orthodox teachings and beliefs. And so they were condemned soundly. Well, you know the rest of the story, right? Obviously, Ptolemy becomes discredited. His worldview is proved not to be the true representation or explanation for the universe. And at least Copernicus and Galileo, to a much greater extent, is given, ordained or confirmed or given the Nobel Prize for deciding what the correct interpretation of the way the universe works, right? And thanks now to the Webb telescope, now we're pushing hundreds of millions of years, which disturbs everybody else's view of things, right? Because if you read the Bible correctly, we all know that creation only happened in 6 24-hour days. And thanks to a Bishop Ussher in about the, I don't remember exactly the year, 16th century, Bishop Ussher says it had to happen. This is not exact literal truth. August the 2nd at 10 a.m. in the morning, around about 3000 BC. That's not exactly correct. You can go to your phones and find out the correct answer on that. But in any event, Bishop Ussher says creation can't be any older than what the Bible says it is. And so people for generations said, this is what the worldview that I have based upon the Bible tells me the truth because it must be true, because it's God's revealed, inspired word. Along comes few people over years because then they begin to discover bones of dinosaurs. Well, where in the Bible are the dinosaurs? What day were they created on? Well, wow, now thanks to scientific means and methods, wow, these seem to be older than 3,000 years old. They're much, much older. Along comes, fast forwarding the story, right? Along comes somebody and he's off in these strange islands in the Pacific. And he begins to, he studies and does research and he says, you know, the animals on these islands are different from one another, even though they are the same. Why are they different? And as he begins to study these birds and animals, he begins to develop a new theory. And the new theory says, you know, things evolve and change and adapt. And while they are similar or the same, they're not really similar. Well, how does this process happen? Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over generations, centuries, hundreds of thousands of years. Well, you know him, right? Darwin, that's another answer on Jeopardy, and the theory of evolution. And pretty soon people go, we look around, this seems to be a much better worldview explanation for reality than what we had based our truth on, our hope on, in terms of the biblical truth. Now, I'm only telling you from the Western Christian point of view. Those Buddhists and Hindus in China and India, of course, have a completely different interpretation and understanding, but they're inferior to us in the West. Now, you see how a worldview can carry with it prejudice and bias to it? By the way, it's also interesting to note that in reading Genesis as an explanation for creation, of course, if you've done any study, every civilization has a story of creation. And none of them match the Bible. Now, how is that possible? If our story is the truth, how can their stories be true? Well, that's for about 3 more hours of reflection, right? Along comes this theory and it blows the stability, the explanations, the truths out of the water. And the response to it is not a wholehearted embracing of this new way of seeing reality. In fact, religionists in the West, primarily in Protestant Christianity, decide that this new worldview so threatens the stability, the integrity, and the, quote, orthodoxy of our beliefs, that we're going to reject it outright. And we're going to insist that we have to return and restore the fundamentals of truth in the West. And hence, at least through several Protestant scholars, the whole movement of fundamentalism comes into Christianity in the West. Not that there hasn't been fundamentalism in the past. And not, by the way, that fundamentalism is restricted to religion, because certainly any worldview can go in the direction of fundamentalism, meaning my worldview is right, correct, expresses the truth, and you have no right to question my worldview because I know I am right and you are wrong, and your worldview is wrong. So whether it's in science or politics or economics or religion, that we can all come down the path of thinking that, quote, our tradition is the norm for everyone, including Western Christianity thinking that its truth, its understanding of God is the norm for everyone. And if you don't agree with us, ask the people who suffered during the Acquisition what response you get to that. And so on as the story goes. I tell you that because if you remember, the Gospel of Matthew arises in that point of struggle between a shifting worldview. That Matthew's Jewish community coming out of the destruction of the temple and the almost destruction of Judaism of the day, that they are convinced that it was because they had become too open, too accepting, too ready to embrace the truths of the Greeks and the Gentiles. And so the best way to resolve this, the best way to survive this tremendous upheaval is to return to the tradition, meaning the literal interpretation of the Torah, the literal practice of all the rituals and all the rules that had actually come over a long period of time through evolution within the life of the faith community, that restoring and returning to those traditions was the way it was going to survive. And indeed, if you look at history, that the survival of Judaism does in fact rest upon not that strict interpretation of the Torah, but the willingness to embrace the idea that truth can be found not only in the written tradition, but also in the oral tradition, so that a community develops an interpretation of what's written. And in that development of oral tradition, that one finds a way to adapt over a long period of time. And that's where Judaism finds itself today. But what about the Gentiles in the community? The Gentiles in the community say, we already know that there are multiple diverse worldviews. We already know that truth can be found in many different ways. And hence, in this story today, and I think I might have mentioned it for those who were here last week. These Magi and the range of interpretations, translations, range from astrologers, seers, wise people. I mean, there are, by the way, kings are never mentioned, that there are many ways to understand. Think now, in the first century culture, describing these visitors, possibly as Persians, that in this visitation comes a way of viewing reality and the world that is completely different from the community's vision and reality of the world. And so these wise men come from the east, obviously Gentile in a way, they're Persian. They're astrologers, for God's sake. Even though within the Judaism of the day, there were people who were throwing dice and looking at tea leaves and all of that, there were already people within Judaism of the day that were using all sorts of ways to discern the truth. That these individuals come from outside, and now the people in the community have to figure out, will we stay with the tradition, how things have always been, the interpretations that we've always had, the way of viewing the world? Do we hold fast to that in order to survive? Or do we open to this new way of thinking? I asked a question, and I posed this last week too for those who were here. I asked this question: is it possible that our adherence to and our dependence upon the worldview that we have been given, or the worldview that is supplied to us in the culture and the society in which we live, does that adequately, by itself alone, provide enough meaning and understanding for us in our lives? I would hope not, because any of us who come from another ethnic tradition or a variety of ethnic traditions, we know that our ancestors who come from other places contribute to who we are today. And it's only when we have an awareness of where our ancestors come from, Ireland, Germany, from Spain, from wherever, Africa, wherever our ancestors have come from, that it's when we bring their spirit, their world into our world, that our world is enhanced. Our world is made richer. Who we are as individuals becomes richer and more inclusive, if you will. I say that because now thinking of this, is the path ahead, and Pat asked the children the question, so where do they go when they go home? I have to imagine that the wise men might have been totally disappointed by this. Disappointed in the sense that they end up in some cow barn, going in, and all they see is what? A mother and child. And notice, not even the father is mentioned there. They have to be totally disappointed. Well, we come all this way, so we might as well give the gifts that we bring. And you notice in the story, it says nothing about what Mary and Joseph do with those gifts. I want to know, what happens to the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh, right? Do they just leave them there for the whoever to show up and to free will take them? What happens to that stuff? Have you ever wondered that question? It's like, what happens to the gifts that get brought there? Probably there's some church somewhere in Italy that has. I just have to think of that somewhere there is. Yeah, just like there's a church in Rome, in the Church of Mary the Major, that some of the crib is still there. Seriously? I tell you, because sometimes you see people put so much trust and truth in the literal that we forget the powerful symbolic character of this. Truth comes from outside. And the invitation, I think, of this text among all the other interpretations of this text that there are, is an invitation to know that holding fast to tradition in a fundamentalist way does not permit innovation to happen. Someday I'll have to show, I used it in a class. I don't know if anybody ever remembers Steve Jobs' first commercial for Apple. First commercial was, here are the weirdos, the people who think outside the box, the people, and he has a whole list of people who have thought outside of the tradition. He said, these are the innovators who brought an advancement to society and humanity in ways that their peers and contemporaries thought they were crazy people. He said, these are the ones who move us ahead. Question, what about us here at Chapels? Are we moving anybody ahead? Are we moving ourselves ahead individually? Are we moving the church ahead anywhere? Are we moving ahead with the vision that we'll hear as we come along in the next few weeks with Matthew's gospel? Are we moving ahead in implementing that vision anymore? Are we still locked into a tradition that interprets reality either based on fear or afraid to change, or based upon the belief that we're quite happy and satisfied with where we are, that there's nothing more to achieve or accomplish, or maybe a resignation that they ain't going much of anything? If those were all the worldview and lenses that we look at life through and church through, then we're not thinking outside the box. We're not being weird people or the prophets. We're not advancing the vision of the reign of God where it needs to be going. Imagine a star, light, a relight of each other and the world to advance, progress, evolve, innovate, to be who we can be, potential inside of us, what it can be for the world. That's, to me, what it is.